Imagine walking through a quiet village in early 19th century Scotland. The factories are humming, but not in the way we've come to expect from the grimy, soul-crushing images of industrial England. Here, in New Lanark, children are laughing, not laboring. Workers have access to schools, housing, clean streets, and even art. There's no overseer screaming down the line. Instead, there's a man named Robert Owen, an industrialist who believed that business and compassion didn't have to be opposites, that perhaps they could be partners. And far away, in the salons of France, another dreamer named Charles Fourier was sketching out something even stranger, a world where people lived in harmonious collectives called phalansteries, where work was aligned with passion, and no task was too humble if it suited your soul. A world where oceans would one day turn to lemonade, and even the animals would be free from exploitation. To our ears, it may sound like fantasy, but to Fourier, it was the natural evolution of love and logic, finally allowed to shape the world. Long before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels gave us the Communist Manifesto, these early visionaries were already reaching for something radical, something restorative. They weren't focused on violent revolution or dialectical materialism. Their project was more human. They imagined societies not torn apart by class warfare, but held together by cooperation, creativity, and mutual care. This was the heart of what came to be known as Utopian socialism, a movement grounded not in conflict, but in possibility. Where Marx later accused them of being naive and disconnected from the real mechanisms of history, these thinkers offered something equally valuable: an ethical foundation, a dream of the good that didn't wait for history to unfold, but dared to shape it. And so, while Marx may have criticized their methods, he could not erase their influence. Because every structure, no matter how scientific or revolutionary, needs a soul. And the Utopians gave socialism its soul. But to truly understand why these dreams mattered and what they were reacting against, we have to look more closely at the world that birthed them. The world shaped by smoke, steel, and suffering. To understand the dreams of the Utopian socialists, we first have to step into the world that gave birth to their longing. The Enlightenment had promised progress. Science, reason, and industry would supposedly liberate humanity from ignorance and poverty. And in some ways, it did. Steam engines roared to life. Cities expanded with new energy. Trade flourished. But beneath the marvels of invention and the philosophies of liberty, another reality was taking root. A darker, more mechanical one. Factory labor replaced artisan work. What had once been a craft passed down through generations became repetitive. Grueling tasks performed for 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, under the flickering gaslight of crowded industrial halls. Children, barely able to tie their own shoes, were sent into coal mines and textile mills, their tiny hands more useful for delicate machinery. The countryside emptied as rural families flooded into cities, seeking survival more than opportunity. What they found were slums, tight, unsanitary quarters where disease spread faster than wages ever could. The old feudal order was collapsing. Kings and lords were giving way to a new ruling class, the capitalist bourgeoisie. They didn't inherit their power through bloodlines, but through profit margins. And while their rise brought innovation, it also brought imbalance. A yawning gap opened between the owners and the workers. Wealth was no longer just a matter of nobility. It was a matter of exploitation. Beneath the surface, unrest simmered. Laborers began to murmur. Protests erupted. In France, revolutions came in waves. In Britain, Chartists demanded rights. Across Europe, people began to see that the promises of progress had left many behind. The question, then, began to burn in the hearts of thinkers, workers, and even some capitalists with conscience. Is this really the best we can do? Must progress come at the cost of our humanity? Or could we imagine a different world, one where the machine served the soul, not the other way around? That's where the Utopian socialists stepped in. They didn't wait for revolution. They didn't hide behind theory. They started building, dreaming, writing, and experimenting. Not just critiquing the system, but reimagining society itself. And among the first of them was a man who believed that kindness could be woven into capitalism. A man named Robert Owen. Robert Owen didn't come from nobility. He wasn't born into wealth or power. He was a self-made man, born in Wales in 1771, the son of a saddler. By the age of 10, he was working. By 20, he was managing a cotton mill. And by his 30s, he was one of the most successful industrialists in Britain. But unlike most men of his stature, Owen wasn't content with profits alone. He looked around at the broken system of labor, children crushed under factory schedules, families housed in squalor, and he dared to ask, what if industry could be humane? At New Lanark, a mill town in Scotland that Owen took over in the early 1800s, he began his grand experiment. He shortened working hours. He banned child labor under 10. He built schools, not just for literacy, but for imagination and moral development. He offered decent housing, fair wages, and cooperative community life. All of this while still running a profitable business. For Owen, it wasn't utopian theory. It was reform in action. He believed that people weren't inherently wicked or lazy. He believed they were shaped by their surroundings. That if you created the right environment, one rooted in education, dignity, and cooperation, human beings would naturally flourish. It was, in a way, a radical faith in goodness. But Owen's dreams didn't stop at New Lanark. In the 1820s, he crossed the Atlantic with hopes of building an even greater model. New Harmony, a planned community in Indiana. It would be a utopia of shared labor, no private property, and enlightened self-governance. But it collapsed within just a few years, undone by internal conflicts, logistical issues, and perhaps the simple challenge of trying to create a perfect society in an imperfect world. Still, Owen's legacy endured. He inspired early trade unionists, cooperative stores, and mutual aid societies. His ideas about shared ownership and worker-run institutions laid the groundwork for movements that continue to this day, from credit unions to employee-owned companies. He may not have sparked a revolution, but he sparked imagination. And he proved that socialism didn't have to start with blood. It could start with a school, a safe home, a shorter shift. Owen's socialism was rooted in action, in proof of concept. But while he focused on what could be done here and now, another dreamer, Charles Fourier, was lifting his gaze towards something even stranger. Something utterly fantastical, and yet strangely seductive. If Robert Owen was the builder of better mills, then Charles Fourier was the architect of better dreams. Born in France in 1772, Fourier looked at the world not through the eyes of a reformer, but through the soul of a visionary. He saw that repression of desire, creativity, and individuality was at the heart of human misery. And so he proposed something wildly different. What if, instead of suppressing human passions, we aligned society around them? He called it passional attraction. Fourier believed that every person had a unique set of desires, quirks, and instincts. Not flaws to be managed, but gifts to be orchestrated. In his mind, a just society wasn't one that forced people into conformity. It was one that allowed each individual's natural inclinations to find their perfect place in the social whole, like instruments in a symphony. Harmony, not discipline, was the goal. To house this harmony, he imagined the phalanstery, a kind of living organism in architectural form. These were to be self-sufficient communities of about 1,600 people, each one carefully designed to maximize cooperative work, shared joy, and personal freedom. Labor would no longer be a burden. It would be an expression of one's deepest inclinations. If someone loved gardening, let them grow food. If another enjoyed caring for animals or organizing social events, they'd thrive too. Even tasks like cleaning or sanitation, Fourier claimed, would find their natural lovers. And for those who didn't? Well, the community would balance itself out. Passion, when trusted, would make duty sweet. And then there were the other visions. Oceans, Fourier insisted, would one day turn into lemonade. Wild animals would become friendly. Human nature would evolve when no longer warped by competition. Women, he believed, should have complete sexual and social freedom. Marriage would no longer be a trap. Children would grow up surrounded by joy, not punishment. It all sounds fantastical, because it was. But within the eccentricity, there was a deeper truth. Fourier understood that labor and love had been divorced by industrial capitalism, and he longed to bring them back together. Though few full phalansteries were built, his ideas spread. In France, in the US, even briefly in Brazil, people tried to translate his blueprints into community life. And while most collapsed, the longing they revealed, the desire for a world that feels good to live in, never fully disappeared. Yet not every utopian was guided by emotion or intuition. Some, like Saint-Simon, believed the future belonged not to passion, but to planning. If Fourier was the dreamer of oceans turned lemonade, Claude Henri de Saint-Simon was the blueprint maker. Born into French aristocracy just before the Revolution, Saint-Simon saw firsthand how brittle the old hierarchies had become. The church, the nobility, their authority was collapsing. But rather than mourn the fall of the old world, he welcomed it. What disturbed him was not the end of tradition, but the chaos left in its place. He believed that humanity needed a new kind of order, one rooted not in inheritance or dogma, but in usefulness, in reason, in science. For Saint-Simon, the future didn't belong to kings or priests. It belonged to engineers, scientists, industrial managers, the people who could do things, who could organize production, manage resources, and solve real problems. He envisioned a society led not by the privileged, but by the capable. Those who contributed to the common good would rise. Those who merely inherited wealth or titles would fade into irrelevance. His vision wasn't grounded in sentiment. It was grounded in systems. He spoke of a future where massive planning could replace competition, where industry could be harnessed for collective well-being rather than individual profit. He believed in a rationally organized economy, run like a vast machine with every cog in its rightful place, guided by knowledge rather than ideology. And though he didn't call it socialism in the way Marx later would, his ideas laid a critical foundation. He proposed public works programs, advocated for the poor, and emphasized the moral imperative of productivity serving society as a whole. Saint-Simon's impact didn't end with his life. His followers helped inspire the first attempts at planned economies. His influence can be seen in the roots of modern technocracy, the idea that governance should be based on expertise, not charisma. He even mentored a young Auguste Comte, who would go on to develop the discipline of sociology, formalizing the study of society as a kind of science. In a way, Saint-Simon represents the mind of utopian socialism, just as Owen represents its hands and Fourier, its heart. Their methods diverged, but their purpose did not. Because in the end, these early socialists were united by something deeper than theory. They all believed that society could be better, that human beings were not doomed to struggle and division forever, that somewhere, beyond the factories and fortunes, a better design for living was possible. For all their differences, Owen with his schools, Fourier with his passions, Saint-Simon with his plans, there was a powerful thread running through them. A quiet, radiant faith in the human spirit. These early socialists believed something that, even today, feels almost revolutionary. That people are not inherently greedy, violent, or selfish. That given the right environment, one built on fairness, dignity, and love, we could become something more. Not perfect, perhaps, but better, kinder, freer. They saw not just what humanity was, but what it could be. That's ethical optimism. And it was the soul of their work. They rejected the cold competition of industrial capitalism, the idea that you must climb over others just to survive. In its place, they dreamed of cooperation, mutual aid, shared effort, a world where success wasn't hoarded but held in common, where we rose together, not alone. Education mattered deeply to them, not just facts and figures, but moral development, awakening curiosity, empathy, and imagination. They understood that if you want a just society, you don't start with laws or economies. You start with people, with children, with what they learn to value. That's why they emphasized the social environment. That's why they honored labor, not as punishment, but as participation in the collective good. And perhaps most importantly, they saw people as whole beings, not just workers or consumers or numbers on a chart, but emotional, spiritual, social creatures, longing for beauty, for meaning, for connection. Their socialism wasn't just economic, it was moral. It was, in its own way, sacred. But that sacred vision would not last unchallenged. Because soon, a new kind of socialism would emerge, one grounded not in dreams, but in dialectics. And its architect was a man who admired the passion of these utopians, but saw their method as fatally flawed. His name was Karl Marx. Karl Marx respected vision, but he didn't trust dreams. To Marx, the utopian socialists, Owen, Fourier, Saint-Simon, were well-meaning, even admirable. But ultimately, in his eyes, they were missing the point. Their plans were lofty, yes, but to him, they floated above the real world, disconnected from the material conditions shaping history. They weren't rooted in class struggle, in the hard realities of economics and power. They were, as he famously wrote in the Communist Manifesto, fantastical, even reactionary, because they offered solutions without a revolution. For Marx, the problem wasn't just that capitalism was unjust. It was that capitalism created its own gravediggers. That history moved through contradictions. That society changed not by moral persuasion, but by material pressure, by workers rising up when their exploitation reached a boiling point. He called his version scientific socialism. It wasn't about building model communities or appealing to the good in people. It was about analyzing history, understanding power, and unleashing revolution. Dialectics replaced design, class replaced character. And rather than imagine better systems from scratch, Marx sought to uncover the forces that were already breaking the old one apart. And yet, Marx inherited more than he admitted. From the Utopians, he absorbed the critique of the bourgeoisie, the idea of communal ownership, the rejection of hierarchy, the demand for a world where people mattered more than profit. He even borrowed their moral clarity, though he dressed it in the language of logic and theory. In truth, Marx didn't destroy their vision, he redirected it. He transformed it from a gentle appeal to a call for struggle, from a philosophy of what could be to a roadmap for what must be done. Still, time has softened the edges of this debate. And now, with distance, we can ask a gentler question. Were these early dreamers really wrong? Or were they simply planting seeds, the first roots of a socialist imagination that still hasn't finished growing? We live in a world that feels, at times, like it's unraveling. Climate collapse, gig economies, spiraling inequality, mental health crises in the shadow of endless productivity. The old promises of progress, of perpetual growth, trickle-down wealth, globalized prosperity, have begun to ring hollow. And in this moment of uncertainty, something surprising is happening. People are beginning to dream again. There's a quiet resurgence of utopian thinking, not the naive optimism of ignoring reality, but a courageous refusal to accept it as fixed. We see it in the rise of worker cooperatives, where labor and ownership are shared, in intentional communities that choose collective care over individual isolation, in conversations about universal basic income, degrowth economics, and post-capitalist futures that honor the earth rather than exhaust it. These aren't just policy tweaks. They're reimaginings, whispers of a deeper longing for systems that nourish, not exploit, for structures that reflect our values, not just our fears. And this is where the old utopians find their way back into the conversation. Not as footnotes to Marx, not as failed idealists, but as early torchbearers of a different kind of possibility. They remind us that politics needs more than precision. It needs poetry. That progress isn't just about efficiency, it's about dignity, connection, beauty. In a time when realism often feels like resignation, utopian thinking is an act of spiritual defiance. It says, we are more than what the market makes of us. It says, the world could be otherwise. Maybe that's the legacy we need to reclaim. Before socialism became a theory of revolution, it was a language of hope, a way of seeing people not as problems to be solved, but as souls to be honored. And that hope, in the end, may be our most revolutionary tool of all. Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, Henri de Saint-Simon. They weren't just idealists fumbling in the dark before Marx lit the path. They were moral architects. They looked at a world cracking under the weight of industrialism and dared to sketch blueprints of kindness, cooperation, and human dignity. They may not have engineered revolutions, but they seeded the soul of one. Their visions weren't failures, they were foundations. And perhaps today, in the shadow of ecological breakdown, social division, and spiritual fatigue, we need their courage more than ever. Not because their models were perfect, but because their imaginations were alive. And a live imagination, that's the first step toward meaningful change. The future of socialism, or any compassionate vision of society, won't be built by strategy alone. It will need stories, values, longings that reach deeper than statistics. Yes, we need structure, but we also need vision, because a world without dreams is a machine. And no one was born to be machinery. So perhaps it's fitting to end not with theory, but with a whisper from the utopian heart. The world we live in is not the only one possible. And dreaming, dear soul, is not a retreat. It is the beginning of return.